Do you know what it's like to have a job and be unable to do that job because one of the subjects of your job has hit you with a lawsuit?
The year is 2014, and this video by Jim Sterling introduced many to a developer that would be the most notorious to ever publish games on Steam.
And blah blah blah, 2 years after it all kicked off, I get a sheriff knocking on my door handing me a lawsuit for over $10 million. And there we have it, Romain v. Stanton Mark 1. Nature of suit, 320 assault, libel and slander. The amount demanded in compensation for me doing some YouTube videos and articles about their shit business practices and horrible attitudes toward the general public, $10,761,000.
While time may have passed, the legacy that Digital Homicide crafted with their shrewd and childish tactics has not only left a guide on how not to treat your customers, but also shows us how integral criticism is to ensuring that companies and producers are held responsible for their practices and behaviors. The first game I played was Wyatt Derp. No, not the certified badass that participated in the shootout at the OK Corral, inspired the film Tombstone, and the film sharing his own name, Wyatt Earp. This is Wyatt Derp, with a D, which is about the grade this game would get if submitted to a high school coding class. So I've covered most of the Digital Homicide library back in my first year on YouTube, but I approached each game as if I was playing it for the first time. Wyatt Derp is a basic wave-based shooter with its semi-broken animations. It plays okay, but one of my main problems is that you must press escape in order to increase stats. While this isn't inherently bad, it feels a little awkward considering it has inconsistent sounds and doesn't always pause opponents. This leaves the user wondering if the game is actually paused, especially considering how often you have to enter this menu. These sudden shifts in pacing are really distracting, and take away any positives that this game may have had. Unfortunately, Wyatt Derp would set a standard that we'll see in many of the games to come. Wyatt Derp 2, like any good sequel, changes from the original. However, these changes are limited to a change in the camera angle, and other than that, it is functionally the same game, bugs included. Just like its predecessor, the waves are set to a timer, instead of being based on when you kill the last opponent. This can lead to hijinks that can be reasonably fun, including when the massive hordes die after the round instead of immediately after a dynamite explosion. And that's really the only entertainment you're going to get from the Wyatt games. But at least it's better than having to take care of a rampaging toddler. If anything can convince you that children are hellspawn, it's Temper Tantrum. In this game, you take control of the worst child demon you can imagine. The thing is that peaking this early in a game about a rampaging toddler surprisingly fits the story of Digital Homicide. While far from perfect, the premise is simple and the controls are awkward. Despite this, it still manages to provide more of an arcade feel than any of the other titles. I think a lot of it has to do with the choices feeling intentional, such as when Candy forces the child to automatically run and have much wider turning radiuses. It's just as difficult as controlling a real child hopped up on too much sugar. This adds to the challenge by forcing you to either get used to the speed or strategically plan out your candy intakes, which will then make you vulnerable to the orbs chasing you. I think I might actually be saying that this game is good. Well, at least when looked at from a certain mindset, especially when compared to their other games, but this really isn't much of a bar. The fact that you could ever possibly make a worse game than one from 1982 is beyond me. Winged Knight's Penetration is a blatant ripoff of Joust. The only major differences are that the lance can impale multiple riders at once, and that the AI have a tendency to get underneath you and fly you into the ceiling. The handling on the ground is slower than the original, and the flying, Well, if you've never played Joust, then I think a similar comparison would be Flappy Bird, except that you can change directions. However, the randomness of Joust is gone, replaced by an AI that automatically locks onto you when you get within a certain range. You would think that this could be an improvement, but what it does is it transforms a game that's reliant on precision and maneuvering to a horde of pursuers approaching from one direction while the lance inconsistently performs. But at least it's not the worst adaptation, right? Top-down shooters have come a long way since the day of Space Invaders and Galaga. However, Krog Wars seems to have placed its gameplay somewhere between the two. Krog Wars is buggy and has near impossible bosses. While you can upgrade damage, the currency drop is so slow that I'd be able to afford to buy a mansion in real life before I could buy an upgrade in this game. That being said, at least there is a game to play. Dungeons of Cragmore was an online survival dungeon crawler. What was it like? No idea. While my inevitable rant about online-only games is best served elsewhere, the lack of content incentivized me to check out the music player that's surprisingly available on most of Digital Homicide's work. My opinions? I started playing Devil's Share using the silly mode, and it did kind of make me chuckle at the absurdity. But that's probably where I should have left the game. While thematically interesting, this game has a lot of problems, most noticeable being the most useless flashlight I have ever seen. Half of the time, the character doesn't even point it in the direction you're facing. This forces you to face your camera at weird angles just to get a look at something in dark places. The enemies are bad too. They walk silently, spawn randomly and rapidly, they hit you through walls, and become instantly aware of your presence when you come within a certain distance of them. The guns are decent and ammo is plentiful and responds quickly and audibly. Unfortunately, the audio cue is the same sound as when the enemies attack. Add this to random respawns, and this will keep you randomly turning around in less familiar buildings. I don't think I've encountered a game that's had this type of problem before. If its goal was to keep you on your toes, then the mission is accomplished. I haven't flinched this much since the Claymore in Modern Warfare 2. Likely one of the more famous games in the Digital Homicide library, Deadly Profits is one of the clearest examples of an asset flip. There is an odd assortment of enemy characters, largely ignoring artistic cohesion. These then charge at the player in single file, in what is likely another contender for the most functional game in the collection. The progression elements may be stupid, but at least they work. The gameplay could be worse, and while the difference between primary spells feels a little negligible, the secondary spells can do some pretty cool stuff. It may be a little janky, and the AI may be dumb, but at least there's boobs, so it's a 10 out of 10, right? After dropping that bomb, you'd figure that attrition nuclear domination wouldn't leave much of an impact, and you'd be right. This RTS game is basically what geothermal nuclear war from Wargame would be like if it was a clicker. While you might be able to defend yourself well enough to survive, it still feels like the only way to win the game is to not play. Even with an auto-clicker running, getting resources, defending yourself, and attacking can be excruciatingly difficult, especially with all the chaos. But that might actually be the point. Going from the most difficult game in the lineup to what is likely the easiest was a happy coincidence. Mini Attack Submarine is what you get when you mix a side-scroller shoot-'em-up with dynamite fishing. While not as easy as shooting fish in a barrel, the enemies are just as defenseless. The most danger that you'll face is an enemy that tracks you a little bit, but they're still pretty easy to avoid. I don't know why they're using a submarine to mercilessly hunt down aquatic creatures, but it could have made for one hell of a story. It's a little bit of a shame if you think about it. However, something that isn't a missed opportunity is Withering Kingdom Arcane War. This is another version of Wyatt Earp with a fantasy skin. It plays the same and shares the same bugs. Again. Come to think of it, Withering Kingdom War does have one major difference to Wyatt Earp. Unfortunately, that difference is a terrible graphical glitch. How many times can you release the same game and get away with it? Well, apparently 3 times is the limit, because Withering Kingdom Flurry of Arrows actually changes the formula a bit. They seem to fire faster and have a more subtle firing sound that keeps it from being as annoying as the other games. The other change is that the enemies don't fire projectiles. Instead, they have a melee attack that has an unknown area of effect. These simple changes are enough to actually encourage you to stop the enemies before they build up close to you. This means that Withering Kingdom Flurry of Arrows is likely the most faithful to what Digital Homicide was actually going for. But this can't be said about the next game. Starship Nova Strike has to be the worst side-scroller shoot-'em-up I've ever played. Upon spawning into the game, you're met with emptiness, or at least I was. While this is fine since it gives you an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the controls, you then encounter an object. At first, you think it may be an enemy, then a moment later, you see the ship that fired it. Then it clicks. Enemies off-screen can fire at you. While this likely applies the other way around too, it makes the game feel terrible. The screen can be a mess of projectiles, ships, and asteroids as you try to blind fire to clear a safe path. Take all that and add an inconsistent frame rate, and you have a recipe for an insufferable mess, proudly presented by Digital Homicide. The next game starts off with a novel's worth of expositive text. After you finish reading it, you find yourself in a free-roaming survival horror called Paranormal Psychosis. Sounds like the type of condition that I'll be diagnosed with when I finally realize I've spent my entire life in a padded cell. And sadly, playing the game makes me wish I was in a padded cell instead. The world is empty and you're pointed in a direction with no idea really of what you're looking for, or of any goal other than getting to the mansion. Environments are ugly, ammo is minimal, and enemies are bullet sponges. There's no real buildup of tension, there's no escaping from the werewolf, and there's no opportunity to make it interesting. Ever want to roleplay as a giant space monster, leaving entire solar systems in your destructive wake? Well then, the Decimation of Olarath might be the game for you. While there are enemies here, they're easy enough to allow you to get familiar with the controls, and inevitably notice that it punishes people with multiple monitors, since it uses your regular cursor to control Olarath. So you then destroy planets by running into them or firing what looks like some sort of plasma from your tentacles. Your primary objective is to take out the system's respective star, which crashing into hurts. But then you go into the next level, eat a few planets to heal, and repeat. That is, until you realize that your plasma could kill the sun, neglecting the need to heal, since enemy ships usually are easily avoidable. Once you realize this, it makes playing the game redundant. There's not enough of a threat to force you to eat the star, but even if there was, regenerating health is quick enough. And the fact that it doesn't count your kills unless you use plasma makes it not worth it. And just like that, we have yet another online-only game. This time, I just listened to the decent menu music. Up next, we have a contender for the worst FPS of all time. Galactic Hitman is an ugly sci-fi shooter with hit-scan enemies packed into tight corridors with minimal cover. Grenades are pathetic, and gunplay feels awful. Once you realize that it's nearly impossible for enemies to hit you while you're crouched, it turns into a cakewalk. I attempted to make things fun by charging the enemies with my knife or pelting them with grenades, but even cheesing the game can't salvage it. Sadly, one of the more competent games, notorious Revenge, is best described as a beat-em-up with bare-bones gameplay. This is one of the few games on the list where you can shut off your brain and just play. Is it anything special? No. Does it have bugs? Yes. Are there worse games? Yeah, but the next game's certainly not one of them. While playing very similar to notorious Revenge, Medieval Mercs takes that concept and turns it into a base defense game with mild RPG elements and even adding a crafting system. While plenty of assets from Deadly Prophet's return, the admittedly loose-feeling combat and cool abilities make it for one of, if not the best game on the list. Sure, it has bugs, but I've played a lot worse, and it's decent in short bursts. Finally, the game we've all been waiting for, the most infamous and notorious. The game that brought Digital Homicide to the public eye and whose criticism justified them to file a $10 million lawsuit. The Slaughtering Grounds is a game I have covered multiple times, so trying to approach this game like I'd never touched it is near impossible. But what I could do was use everything I knew and try to play it with a different mindset. And you know what? I think I found a way to play the game and have fun. Now hold on. Don't leave that comment. Don't click away. Let me explain myself. So imagine you find yourself in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. The only thing you have is a gun with a single magazine. You need no food. You need no water. All you need to do is survive. So what's your first objective? Ammo. The best way to get ammo is to go into buildings and get it. Stay in place for too long and you'll either get killed or run out of ammo. If you move around and face the high-risk, mediocre reward for long enough, you'll have a boss fight that will give you a substantial amount of money to buy upgrades or new characters. I actually got lucky and the money glitched for me, allowing me to collect it multiple times and build up my bank. When the timer at the top of the screen reaches 0, you start a different level. Each level looks and feels different, but the fundamentals stay the same, continuously forcing you to press forward. Does approaching the game this way make it any better? Well, a little bit. But it's still not worth more than a couple of plays, which is more than I can say about the next game. I stumbled upon Not in My Crapper by accident. While I knew about the game and the other Digital Homicide titles that have been lost for history, I found it while browsing free games on indiegala.com. At first I couldn't believe my eyes, but when I downloaded the game and played it, it almost seemed surreal. Up to this point in my life, I've spent approximately 46¼ days voiding my bowels. And with this game, I can finally shit more of my life away. Functionally, it's fine, maybe one of the better top-down shooters, but fundamentally it plays the same as its brothers, with the exception that you're firing shit instead of other projectiles. And with that, we finally come to the end of the Digital Homicide library. And while the Romine brothers have reappeared a few times, they've largely faded into history. But this doesn't mean there's nothing to be learned. Sometimes all it takes to keep a business running, no matter how scummy, is to be able to handle criticism. and not filing a $10 million lawsuit against James Stephanie Sterling or an $18 million lawsuit against 100 anonymous Steam users. Who knows? Maybe they would still be around if they simply knew when to shut up. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, you know what to do. Comment, like, and subscribe. Maybe check out the video right here. Either way, I will see you there. Bye.